Welcome back to App Stories. Today's episode is brought to you by Details Pro. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. We have had an odd week, you and I.
Yes.
We've had all kinds of things going on, which aren't worth getting into, but we do have a very special episode today. It's broken up a little bit because we will be interviewing Susan Prescott and two of the winners of the Apple Swift Student Challenge. And we're also going to talk to a couple of past winners of the same contest, my son Finn.
Yes.
And Ellie O'Sullivan of Cork, Ireland. So Federico and I interviewed Susan Prescott and the two students together, and I interviewed Finn and Ellie separately.
Yeah.
And so you'll hear that in the show, and the audio quality is a little uneven here and there, but it's a great interview. So please bear with us with some of the technical details here, but I think it'll be a great show. And I don't know about you, Federico. I always enjoy the Swift Student Challenge because I like talking to these students because I'm always super impressed with how these kids who are, one of them is that we spoke to is only 13 years old. And it's always amazing to me to talk to people who have learned how to code at such a young age.
Yeah, it's incredible. They're always like incredible, fascinating stories. And I'm jealous because when I was 10 or 13 years old, I was not as intelligent as these kids.
You were playing Pokemon, probably.
I was playing Pokemon on my Game Boy, and I was obsessed with Pikachu. So and these kids are creating apps about climate change and like really important things. And I'm like, these kids are incredible. The kids these days, they're fun. The kids are fine.
Yeah, the kids are fine.
The kids are fine. They're doing great. They're doing great. So yeah, the interviews are fascinating look into what these incredible kids who participated in the Swift Student Challenge can do, have done, and will continue doing in the future.
Yeah, and we're going to keep our eyes on the kids we spoke to and everybody in the Swift Student Challenge, because I'll tell you, over the years, you and I have seen an awful lot of people come out of the Swift Student Challenge to become some of the best app developers whose stuff we're writing about today. And so this really is a program that is feeding the future of app development on Apple's platform. So I think it's important to the company, but I think it's also a great educational opportunity for the kids who participate in it.
Yeah.
So with that, Federico, let's move on to the interviews. Welcome, everybody. We have three very special guests with us today here on App Stories. We are joined by Susan Prescott, the Vice President of Developer Relations, Education, and Enterprise at Apple, as well as two of the Swift Student Challenge winners this year, Harshitha Rajesh and Roscoe Rubin-Rottenberg. Welcome to the show, everybody.
Thank you so much, John.
It's great to have you here. I want to start with you, Susan, with a quick question about the Swift Student Challenge contest, because this is one that's very near and dear to my heart personally, because I have three boys, and my two oldest kids won the Swift Student Challenge early in their careers.
Fantastic.
Yeah. One when they were in high school and one when they were in college, and they're both developers now working on Apple platforms. So I've kind of seen firsthand the impact that this can have on students at a wide range of ages. But I also know that the contest has changed a lot over the years. My oldest son was in it in 2013, and it was a very different kind of contest back in those days than it is today. Could you explain a little bit about how it worked this year? Because I know there were some changes even this year compared to last year, for instance.
That's true. So along the way, we've done a lot to continue to make sure we open the aperture to really encourage kids who may not fancy themselves a coder, who may not feel confident enough to participate, to encourage them to participate. So that's been something we've been working on over the years. And I think one of the things, so there's a lot of learning materials, a lot of tutorials, a lot of content for the students to find from Apple and from other sources as well. But I think the biggest change this year was really introduction of a new category called the Distinguished Winners, which offers an on-campus experience. But we also open up the random selection process for all winners. And so we're super excited to have a record number of students joining us from Swift Student Challenge this year at WWDC, including Roscoe and Harshitha.
Excellent. Let's dive into the questions for the students because we're really here to spotlight what they've done to be part of the contest. And I want to start with you, Harshita, and get a better understanding about how was it that you learned to code? Where did your journey start to becoming a developer?
I think the first time I actually was introduced to coding was when I was around like 9 or 10, she was learning Python with some online courses, and I would just sit in with her, try to understand. But I didn't get very far with it. It was very intimidating. I started it, but I learned like a few basics, but I didn't get far with it, and I didn't really pursue it further. But I was really interested in coding. So then few years later, like now, heard about Swift Student Challenge. And like Susan said, I do not see myself as a coder, although I was interested in it. So yeah, when I saw the Swift Student Challenge, I began researching into what Swift was because I didn't know what Swift was in the beginning. I researched, found out more about Swift and also how you could learn it. And I used Swift Playground, the app, because I don't have a Mac, I was on my iPad. And it was seriously very helpful for someone like me who I barely know coding. Like now I know a lot more, but learning from the beginning, it was very helpful. And yeah, that's how I first began learning.
That is such an interesting story, Arshita, especially the part about you learning how to code using an iPad and Swift Playgrounds, because that is like one of the common arguments, like that reading on websites or YouTube channels that like if you want to learn how to code, you got to use a Mac. And I mean, obviously the Mac is a great platform, but like I think it speaks to the potential of the iPad in terms of like the accessibility of the iPad, that you were able to just pick it up and use Swift Playgrounds and start coding. I think that's a really interesting journey. And I guess did you stay on the iPad or did you graduate sort of to a Mac or to like another computer? Are you still coding on the iPad right now?
As for now, I am still coding on the iPad, but we are getting a Mac because yeah, even my parents saw how interested I was in this. So yeah, we're getting a Mac. But this has been really helpful too, just on the iPad.
Yeah. So could you explain the project that you submitted for the challenge a little bit more in detail?
Yeah, so basically it was meant to be an app about deforestation and it was meant for younger kids. And it was meant to kind of introduce this to them and show why that they needed to do something about this, why it's such a big problem. So the beginning of the app, it's basically there's a view of a forest and there's a character and an earth character who's upset because it has a disease called deforestation. And as you click through each tree of this forest kind of view, you can see there's a paragraph where about what deforestation is, how it affects people, where it's occurring, and what you can do about it. So you can either listen to the audio, read it, and it's basically meant to help you understand why it's such a bad thing, what's happening. And there's also a quiz after it. And this quiz is meant to help enhance your understanding about deforestation, as well as, make sure you actually understood what you read. And once you do the quiz, if you get a certain score, it lets you get a small gift. And this gift is a little plant seed. So there's around 9 tasks you can do with this plant seed. And it basically all the tasks are related to deforestation. There's little things that you can do to make an impact and reduce the effects of deforestation. So as you go through each task, the small plant will grow into a tree, and it's sort of a little fun way to learn more about deforestation while still making an impact.
Nice, right? That's awesome. So what inspired you to create this project and to submit it? Like, what was the motivation behind it?
I mean, I think it was just seeing the effects of deforestation like firsthand, because obviously we've learned about it in school, learned about like how it's bad, how it's affecting everything. But only when you look deeper, you realize that deforestation isn't just cutting down trees. There's global warming, climate change, all of this. Deforestation contributes to all of this. And there's much less awareness around deforestation. So I just think I just wanted to educate others about this.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Now that you've become part of the Apple Developer Program, what are you hoping to get out of it? What's next for you in terms of development?
I mean, I'm excited, first of all, for the Apple Developer Program. I'm excited to use all the tools that come from there to further enhance this idea. But also, I have a few other ideas, and I can't just wait to continue my coding journey, especially with Swift.
Very nice, very nice. So I want to turn my attention to Roscoe, and I want to talk about your project. But first of all, can you give us a little more details on how you got started with coding? How did you learn to code, and sort of your journey to submitting the project for the challenge?
My experience was actually somewhat similar to Harshitha, because I initially got into coding at WWDC 2019, where I watched online and I saw they introduced Swift UI, and they talked about how simple it made coding apps and how little lines of code you needed. And I didn't really understand what that meant, but it sounded really interesting to me. So I downloaded Swift Playgrounds and I started learning Swift, and
a whopping feature. Yes,
was
that's something
really,
that will show up in the style
like,
guide for Apple at
fun,
some point,
and it just made it like a game
whether you should
to learn
capitalize
to
whopping
code.
with it.
And I was only like 9 at the time. And
What do you
then
say we do a show?
a few months ago, I came back to Swift to do the Swift Student Challenge, because when I had initially learned Swift with Swift Playgrounds, I had seen the Swift Student Challenge and thought it would be really cool to apply once I was old enough. And so I did, and surprisingly, I got in.
That's awesome. That's
great. That's fantastic. Could you tell us a little bit about your project and what it does?
Well, again, similar to Harshitha, mine is called Climate Campaign. It's about climate change, and specifically climate policy, and like the compromises needed to get climate policy passed. Essentially, you are the administrator of the EPA, and you have to pass policies that reduce climate change, and you have 3 metrics to reduce: carbon emissions, water shortage, and air pollution. But you have to also keep in mind money left and popularity with voters. So you have to make some compromises and like decide what your priorities are.
Nice. That's very cool, and congratulations
Very interesting.
for submitting these projects, and to both you, Roscoe, and Harshitha. That's such a huge accomplishment, and I hope you have a really bright future in terms of development on Apple platforms.
We'd love to see your apps on Mac Stories someday.
Yes, someday we'll cover your apps on Mac Stories. And before we go, just one final question for you, Susan. Just a sort of a closing thought on the Swift Student Challenge, and sort of where do you think it fits within Apple's other educational and developer and community efforts?
Yeah, I think we see it as one of our onboarding opportunities to bring more people into the developer community. We had winners from 35 countries this year, all over the world, all different kinds of projects again. And so I think it's a great start. I think everybody who does Swift Student Challenge won't necessarily choose to be a coder later in life, but they'll have this skill, the benefits of problem solving and collaboration in creating the app, but also a little more insight into the technology world and the ability to know they can be empowered to do something to change the world. So we think it's great for folks who are going to continue on in coding. And I certainly encourage Roscoe and Harshitha, which is such a bright beginning to their careers, to consider that. But regardless of what you choose to do, you can change the world, and apps are one way you can do it. So
great. Thanks so much. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you both.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Details Pro. Details Pro is a design tool for designers of Apple apps. The app makes life easier for designers the same way that Swift UI makes life easier for developers. Its all-visual interface makes Swift UI accessible to everyone. Want to see if your design can work in Swift UI? Learn the basics like vertical stacks, SF symbols, and Swift UI frame and padding in an easy, accessible environment? Details Pro is the tool for you. It's faster than writing code to mock up a design and more accurate than Canvas design tools because everything is live SwiftUI. Details Pro uses real Apple Hig fonts, colors, and dark mode. Designers can use the app to prove that their designs are possible and can export SwiftUI to Xcode or send their designs directly to developers. Other notable features include Repeat, which makes it easy to design lists, rows, and the type of UI where you normally use symbols. Repeat has built-in capabilities for special cases and changing content so individual elements stay synced but can look different. There's also Grid, which brings SwiftUI grids to designers. Easily pick a number of rows and columns and pair it with Repeat to have a design that builds out with SwiftUI grid layouts. It also has built-in SwiftUI templates that are free and help you with beautiful SwiftUI starting points. And Details Pro lets you design from your Mac, iPad, or iPhone with full feature parity and iCloud sync across devices. Plus, you'll soon be able to design with Vision OS on Vision OS right from Details Pro. Details Pro is free forever for up to 5 files, which is a great way to get a sense for its powerful features before subscribing. Visit detailspro.app today to learn more. Again, that URL is detailspro.app. Our thanks to Details Pro for their support of the show. All right, that was a really fun interview with these students. And you know what? We figured we would go back and talk to some people who've won this award in the past. And we just happen to know a couple of them. One is Finn, my son, and Ellie O'Sullivan. So I thought I would talk to them and get a little more insight into what the Swift Student Challenge is all about, what they thought about it, and kind of what it led them to do. With me right now is Finn Voorhees. Hey, Finn.
Hello.
It's good to have you on App Stories. This is your first time on the show, which is kind of cool. You, of course, have done a fair amount of work for me and Federico over the years, lots of crazy projects from Federico in particular. But I wanted to talk to you not just about the Swift Student Challenge, but also where you got your start coding, because I know it was long before that. And do you remember how you kind of got started?
Yeah, it's sort of hard to remember that far back, but I think initially when I started coding, I think the first thing I did was probably Codecademy, which is sort of an online course. I think it was probably one of the first online coding courses, and that was
I think so.
Mostly HTML, CSS, and then sort of adding JavaScript into the mix. So just making simple websites. And then after that, I don't know, I did a lot of coding, but at some point moved on to experimenting with Electron apps, because that's also, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but can run natively on a Mac. And then ultimately started looking at iOS apps and mainly focusing on coding iOS apps. And then also eventually worked on macOS apps a little and just went further with that.
Oh, in the early days when you first got started with some of the web technologies and Electron, what kind of things were you building back then?
Well, I mean, I was pretty young back then, so probably stupid websites.
All right.
And nothing that was ever really online. But at some point, I worked on like making a little personal website for myself, and I had that up on finvoorhees.com for a while. And then when I was working with Electron, I remember me and some friends worked on an app for recording podcasts, actually, where I think that used WebRTC to basically do what we're doing now, where you can have a call with someone, record a podcast, they'd both record locally, and then you'd end up with a podcast, which is kind of funny because now I work at a startup called Detail, making video editor and recording software for iPhone, and we just added a feature that's basically the same as that with WebRTC, so kind of gone full circle there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. WebRTC is very powerful technology, and there are a lot of services out there for podcasters to use that can do it through a browser. We're kind of doing it the old-fashioned way on Zoom, but it is a great alternative. Especially, I think it's good when you have guests and you're doing an interview like we're doing now, because it really cuts down on the friction of getting someone up and running and recording themselves. All right. So, about how old do you think you were when you started doing some of this stuff? Just to give people an idea of when you got started.
Um, Not entirely sure, but I was probably, I don't know, around 10 maybe. I think.
That sounds right to me because I remember you helped out your brother a little bit with an iOS app he was working on at the time too, and you guys were around that age, if I remember right. So that's a long time ago. I mean, one of the students we talked to today did get her start around 10 years old too, fiddling around with similar stuff, trying Python and some other languages, but really it didn't catch on. It sounds like for her until she really started with the Swift Student Challenge at the age of 13. You did the Swift Student Challenge when you were in college at Trinity College in Dublin, correct?
Yeah, I did that in 2021. So I would have been, I guess, 21.
Okay. All right. Well, what was the experience like? I've this program has changed a lot over the years, and there was a time when you had to code a full-on Objective C program back in the day, but now it's more like I guess Swift Playgrounds based, or I suppose you've got a little more leeway than just that. But what was the process like of building an app for Swift Student Challenge?
Yeah, so I think originally it started out where you had to make an app, and then Apple introduced Swift Playgrounds. And I think the first version of Swift Playgrounds was just kind of a Swift file that you run. So pretty much the minimum amount of Swift code you can write. But at
Hmm.
some point, they introduced that more advanced Playgrounds app where you have like these notebooks with multiple pages, and you can add like markdown content and have like interactive tutorials basically. I'm
Hmm.
not sure when they introduced that, but when I did the Swift Student Challenge, it was after that. So the objective was to make one of those sort of interactive books and present that for the challenge.
Oh, okay. What was the book that you created?
Mine was about Ogham, which is an ancient language here in Ireland where I live.
Hmm.
That was originally carved into these standing stones. Um, and my playground was exploring the history of that. If you look at like the past winners and submissions, a large majority of them are sort of educational based or culturally significant in some way.
Hmm.
So I found like doing something like that seems to be what Apple is most interested in. So mine was like a little, I think it was 3 pages, where the first page explained what Ohm is and had a little Swift UI view on the right that was, I think, completely static and just had a bunch of information about it. And then the next page was a 3D model of one of the stones in Ireland that you
Hmm.
could sort of spin around. Because I think another thing that Apple's looking for in these challenges is good use of their technologies and just how they can be applied. So that
Right.
was 3D model, probably made using SceneKit or something, which is the kind of basic game engine that Apple had. Um, and then the third page was this interactive Swift UI view where you can type in a sentence and it'll translate it to Ohm characters on the bottom. So just kind of a
Oh,
little
that's cool.
fun interactive demo on some history of the ancient language.
Oh, that's very cool. Very cool. So, do you have any advice, I guess, for where students could get started if they're interested in getting into, whether it's iOS development or Mac development or even Vision OS? I mean, what's a good starting point, say, for maybe, I don't know, someone who's, in high school or maybe even younger than that?
Yeah, I mean, for just general coding, there's a million resources out there, all kinds of websites like Code Academy, I'm pretty sure is still around, where you can just do these free courses online. But specifically for iOS, you'd probably want to be learning Swift first. And to do that, there's I think on Swift.org, there's a Swift programming language book which walks you through an introduction to Swift, and I think that's meant for beginners who haven't programmed at all before. There's also some other resources made by community members, like I know 100 Days of Swift is part of. I think the website's called Hacking with Swift, and that's like a 100-day course on introduction to Swift. And I think that sort of has a focus on iOS development. And then once you have the basics of Swift, then Apple has some courses like introducing Swift UI, and a bunch of different technologies that you can go through to learn more sort of specifically iOS focused aspects of making an app.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think Apple does have a lot on kind of their educational pages that I'll link in the show notes too, because there's a lot of online books and other resources. Some are meant for teachers, some are meant for students. So there's a good mix there, and a lot of things that you can kind of dig into and learn from. I wanted so you're primarily writing in Swift these days, is that right?
Yeah, pretty much 100% in Swift. When I was working at Shiny Frog on the app Bear, there was some old code that the original version of Bear was written in Objective-C. So I was doing a tiny bit of work just patching that code still, but pretty much entirely moved over to Swift now.
Okay. And how about with detail? What are you using Swift UI for some of that app, or are you doing more custom things? Because I know it's kind of a very specialized app I mean, I guess you should explain too what it does.
Yeah, so Detail is a video editing and recording app. Originally, we released it for macOS, where it was kind of a recording studio where you can set up different scenes with different cameras, record a timeline, edit it. And that was kind of similar to something like OBS, but with also video editing tools built in. And then just over a year ago, I think we released Detail for iOS, which is sort of similar, but on iPhone, where you can record multicam video with different lenses, sync two iPhones together, and all kind of tools for making video creation easier. So we started Detail for iOS about a year and a half ago. So that was entirely Swift. And at the start, it was entirely UIKit, just because we found it to be a little bit more straightforward to develop the UI that we were aiming for, especially with video. A lot of the lower level views for like displaying video on the screen are not really available in Swift UI, or they're a bit limited. But recently, for things like, I don't know, submenus where you have mostly static UI, Swift UI has come real handy there, where you can just quickly prototype a design and implement it in a few minutes and see the live previews and everything. So it's helpful in cases like that where you just want to quickly iterate on a design.
All right. That sounds good. That sounds good. All right. Well, before I let you go, I do want to, since Federico's not here for this interview, I figure it's time to give him a little bit of a hard time. And I want to know, what is the strangest project that he has ever asked you to work on?
Yeah, trying to think back on some of the projects I've done for him. I don't remember what he first asked me to do, but it was probably a few years ago. I think maybe the Slack bot I made for the Mac Stories Slack. I think.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
A few years ago. That was originally for pinging Slack when certain apps updated, I think. And over the past few years, that's slowly transitioned into an iOS app that does the same thing and just sends push notifications. But a lot of what I did at the start for Federico was a lot of Pythonista scripts, which is an iOS app where you can create Python scripts and interact with a lot of the system APIs using Python, sort of similar to how Shortcuts works. And I think we were making those mostly because of limitations of shortcuts back then. So lots of just super specific things for his workflows, like download this video, convert it to this format, and upload it to the Mac Stories CDN or something. So lots of just really super specific things. And then also more recently working on Obsidian plugins, I think they're called. I don't know. Just making a bunch of different Obsidian plugins for whatever he comes up with. So like insert this image as Markdown, upload this image to Mac Stories, or some of the more advanced ones like the Todoist one or the shortcut one. And then I think the most recent project I was working on for him was related to his MacPad setup. So I'm sure everyone knows, but if you haven't heard, it's his half Mac, half iPad, where he connects the iPad to the Mac using Sidecar. But I think he found it pretty challenging to get that Sidecar connection going because you don't have a screen on the Mac, so there's not really any way to do that. And he found, I think he ended up using something he found on GitHub where it was a script you had running on the Mac, and then you ping the Mac from shortcuts on the iPad, and it would start the Sidecar session from the Mac, so you don't ever need to interact with the Mac, really. And I sort of converted that into an actual iPad and Mac app for him, where the Mac app is running in the background on the computer 24/7, and then the iOS app has, if you open the app, it'll list his Mac nearby, and then you can tap it to connect, or it also has shortcuts for it or a widget that you can tap to connect to the Mac. So just sort of
that's cool.
Something really specific that no one else in the world will probably ever need, but he wanted. And that one specifically, I was going to just put up on test flight for him to use, because that's what I do with a lot of these apps where they're not really intended to go on the App Store, but the easiest way to give them to him is just put them up on test flight and add him. But that one was rejected by Apple from even test flight just because, well, originally they didn't like the name of Sidecar, and then I changed it, and they were like, why are you making this app, and who's the intended audience of this? And I didn't really have a good answer to that question, so I just added him as an internal tester.
As an audience of one. Yeah, so you had to get he had to get his UUID and do it that way, I suppose, right?
Yeah, a little bit trickier.
Yeah. Okay. Well, very good. Very good. Well, all right. I'm going to let you go, but before we do, why don't you let people know some of the apps you've got on the App Store, where they might find them, and a quick rundown of what they do, so they can, I don't know, maybe buy one of your apps.
Yeah, sure. So I have a few apps on the App Store right now. The first one is an app for upscaling videos on iPhone and Mac, which uses a feature Apple added recently mainly intended for upscaling video games in real time, but the app uses it to upscale videos to a higher quality. So that's called Unsqueeze. And then I have another app for Vision OS, which is called Shortcut Buttons, which was actually your idea for the app, but I released that where you can place shortcut tiles around you in the Vision Pro and tap them to trigger shortcuts. Then another app called Castaway, which is for streaming HDMI devices to the Vision Pro. So you can plug in like a Nintendo Switch to a capture card to a Mac or iPad and then stream that to the Vision Pro. So kind of a convoluted setup, but people seem to be enjoying playing their games in Apple Vision Pro with that one. And then I also have a very niche app for macOS called HexedEdit, which is a hex editor for, I don't know, any developers out there who need to edit files as bytes, then you can go download that from the Mac App Store.
All right. Very good. Well, that's a lot of apps. I will put links to them in the show notes too. Thanks for joining me today, Finn.
Yep. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, that is enough of talking to Finn. We have heard all about his exploits as a developer and his many apps on the App Store. Now I'm speaking with Ellie O'Sullivan. Hey, Ellie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing really well. So Finn suggested that I talk to you two because when you did the Swift Student Challenge that Apple offers, you were very new to developing and doing code and Swift and all that stuff. And I guess I wanted to ask you first of all, like, what caught your interest about that program in particular? Because so for people who don't know, you are an engineer, but you're not a software engineer. Are you a structural engineer? Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a structural engineer. So I went to Trinity College in Dublin, and I always did have a bit of an interest in coding. So I started in Trinity in the general engineering route. Um,
Okay.
so you start 2 years of general engineering. So we would have covered a bit of computer science aspects, but we mainly did boring computer stuff like C++ and MATLAB. Um, But when we had to choose our stream for the final 3 years of the course, I really struggled to choose between computer engineering and civil structural. But eventually, I reasoned that if I chose civil, I could always pivot back into computers and coding if I wanted to later in my career, because you can always automate things and build cool apps for structures and site inspections and stuff.
Sure.
Um, so the Swift Student Challenge, it just allowed me to have some fun with coding, and I tend to be someone who needs a deadline to finish something off properly. So that definitely helps. Definitely helps too.
Yeah, and I know you've done it twice. Finn, I think, did it once, and you both did it in 2021, kind of in the middle of the pandemic, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, so obviously the pandemic started in 2020. I think
Right.
probably after the 2020 deadline for the Swiss Student Challenge, but it was kind of the summer of 2020. I had an internship cancelled, so I tried to use that summer to brush up on my coding and explore the Swift language and making apps. Um, so yeah, I guess the pandemic did indirectly help me enter the challenge. Just gave me some free time to think about what kind of apps I wanted to make and how to even get started. So yeah.
Yeah, what was it like getting started? Because I mean, I guess you were kind of starting from ground zero. I assume you hadn't had a lot of Swift experience up to that point.
No, I didn't. I don't think I had any Swift experience. I'd only used kind of Python and MATLAB and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, C++. So I did um I did enroll in the online CS50 course. I think it's run by Harvard. So it covers a good few coding languages, and they give you little projects and challenges. So it's a really well structured course. So that's kind of how I got started, and then I just started making my own little apps. Like I made like an app about tea and stuff like that. So it's kind of just debugging and googling things that I learned to just get better, and yeah, made some fun apps, I think.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. What was your project for that first year of the student challenge?
So I created an app about Irish women in STEM.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, I used MapKit to show a map of Ireland with pins for where each of the women were born or lived, and then you could pan around the map and click on the pins and then find out more about each woman and what they had contributed to science and other STEM areas. Um, so yeah, that was a fun one to make. There's a lot of researching, which was interesting for me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I bet you learned a lot from just reading about all those women in Ireland. How about the second project? What'd you do for that one?
Yeah, that was, I think, more of a challenging project for me. So that was 2022. That was the second time I
Uh-huh.
entered. So I was still in my master's year of college. So I was writing a thesis on foundation design for offshore wind turbines, and I was doing other modules like GIS mapping and wind loading and a few other random things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
um, my brain was just full of wind turbines and electricity generation and everything. So
Uh-huh.
that's definitely what inspired that project. So it allowed the user to learn about wind farms, particularly in Ireland. So I wanted to help people understand more about the potential of wind energy in reducing climate emissions. So it's especially relevant in Ireland as we have a very windy country.
Yeah,
So
I was going to say
there's
it's probably a very good place for that.
yeah, so it has big potential for generating electricity from wind, especially with offshore wind farms. So in my app, you could draw your own wind farm, just a simple shape, and then it would calculate roughly how many households it could provide electricity for in Ireland if it was built. And then you could also spin a little wind turbine to see, and then it would tell you how much energy it was generating with your spin.
Oh, that's
Um,
cool.
yeah, so that was a fun one. Definitely way harder than the first one, but worth it in the end, I think.
Yeah, definitely. That does sound like kind of complicated. Let me ask you a guess about what you won as a student, because I think I know at least one, because you and Finn both had your stuff delivered to our house
Yeah.
in the first student challenge. But I'm sure a lot of people listening don't necessarily know what students get if they win the challenge. What did you get those 2 years?
Yeah, so the first year I just got a hoodie with the WWDC branding on it for that year, and there was another few small bits like a hat and some pins, which they were cool. And
Hmm.
then the second year I was expecting to get the same thing, but we actually ended up getting some AirPods Pro, which was a very nice surprise.
Yeah, definitely. I know Finn was a little jealous that you got the AirPods, and
Yeah,
because you were still eligible, because you had the extra year in
extra year, yeah.
university, right? But he was already out and working in the working world, I suppose.
Yes, that was
Yeah.
a nice bonus.
So now that you've been out of school for a couple of years and you're working as a structural engineer, do you ever get the itch to kind of go back and try your hand at coding again?
Yeah, I definitely do. It is something I would like to do more. I am lucky in my job that there's always kind of random things I can volunteer for, so I can kind of switch into digital things if I want. And there would be apps that I would like to make, like I do some site inspection sometimes.
Hmm.
So an app would definitely help reduce the paperwork on those.
Oh, I
Um,
bet.
yeah. And I would like to make one to help my parents on our farm at home. Also, a lot of paperwork there, but it's just hard to find the time sometimes and the brain space to get started.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. No, but those are exactly the kinds of things I think that having, an app, especially if it's on like an iPad or something, are really good at if you're out in the field looking at some site, or you're on the farm and maybe you're not, sitting down at a table inside the house at a laptop. You can carry around an iPad with you. Is that kind of what you're thinking, or something
Yeah,
different than that?
definitely. Yeah, yeah. So we take a lot of photos on site for inspecting various
Oh,
things. So
sure.
yeah, and then most of the time we also have to do a report afterwards. So if I had a nice little app to put that together without me having to manually do that, it will be nice. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, what advice would you have for any students who are kind of just starting out like you did a few years ago, and are interested in maybe, I don't know, starting to explore Swift and maybe enter the challenge in a future year?
Yeah, I really think the CS50 course is a good one to get started. Even if
Hmm.
you don't end up going into Swift, you'll still kind of get a taster for different languages and how they can be used as well. And then it's really just trial and error and figuring out what kind of apps you want to make. Um,
Right. Yeah, I
yeah,
think it really
just
does help. It does help to have a project. You know what I mean? Because then
it
you
definitely
have
does. Yeah.
right. Because then you have something to research. You have a problem to solve, and you can tackle it by. You may not learn everything doing that because you only have certain things you need to know, but it's the first step is to kind of like figure out the structure and figure out the particular APIs and things that you need to deal with for that project, which is, you got to start somewhere, and that's a good way to do it, I think.
Definitely, yeah. And even for the CS50 course, if you are stuck on any projects, there's a lot of online resources and online community groups like on
Hmm.
Reddit and LinkedIn as well. You can always reach out to someone on those and get some help. Yeah, it's always a very small problem that's not obvious to you that manages to fix your issue, I think.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Ellie, thanks for joining me today. It's been a lot of fun talking to you and Finn, as well as the Swift Student Challenge winners.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, Federico. He is back with us after having interviewed Finn and Ellie. Hello, Federico.
Hello, I'm back. Hi.
I hope you enjoy my conversation with Finn and Ellie. And we had a great time chatting with Susan Prescott, as well as the students who are some of the winners for the Swift Student Challenge. We're going to end the episode there, and we'll be back with maybe a little bit more usual format next week. I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so.
But I want to thank our sponsor for this episode. That's Details Pro. You can find me and Federico at macstories.net, where we write every week. You can also find us on Mastodon. Go to vitici.macstories.net and johnvoorhees.macstories.net. You'll find a follow button there to follow both of us on Mastodon. And we're on Threads and Instagram. Federico is at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.